Hi everyone, I'm Josh. I'm a postdoc at Princeton University, and I'll be talking about some recent work scaling up two well-known domains in cognitive science. This work is done with a number of my colleagues, shown here, and my advisor, Tom Griffiths. In particular, I'll be talking about two fairly old but still active paradigms in the field: decision-making and categorization. These domains are interesting case studies because they accompany a well-established set of theories and a relatively stable set of findings from the more traditional laboratory setting that we can explore here in a new context. Let's start with decision-making, which is one of the oldest targets of mathematical models of human behavior, stretching back almost 3 centuries. To preview, we're going to scale things up significantly, but at least in some sense, this is the easy part. What's most exciting is what this enables, which in our case will be to challenge current theories and inspire new ones. To begin, let's familiarize ourselves with the domain. In the classic decision-making paradigm, people are given the option of picking one of two different gambles, A or B. Each gamble is represented as a collection of rewards and their associated probabilities. For example, gamble A in this case provides $16 with certainty if chosen, but gamble B is more risky and can pay much more or much less. Once a decision maker selects a gamble, an outcome is sampled from the distribution and added to the subject's overall earnings. For our project, we wanted to scale up this approach, which means looking at more of these choice problems. But how many do we actually need? To get some sense of this, first consider that we can order the outcomes and probabilities for both gambles of a choice problem and represent them using a fixed length vector, where the size depends on the maximum number of outcomes that any one gamble can take on in an experiment. In the literature, this can be as large as 10, which yields vectors of length 40. After doing this, we can project a set of these vectors into a 2-dimensional space for visualization, using dimension reduction methods like t-SNE. For example, here we show 30 classic problems collected through decades of laboratory experiments. At first glance, it's hard to know if these problems constitute good coverage of the overall space, but since the full space contains 40 dimensions, this seems unlikely. As data collection becomes easier as a result of crowdsourcing tools, this selection has grown. Here we additionally show problems that were randomly generated by Polonsky and colleagues. This is starting to approach better overall coverage of the space, but we want to push this as far as possible. And that's exactly what we did. More specifically, we scaled this procedure up by 2 orders of magnitude, ending up with over 10,000 unique decision problems in total and at least 15 participants per problem. This large survey of human behavior provides a whole lot more to explain, and thus provides a robust test of our current theories. However, it also enables the use of machine learning algorithms, which we can use as a tool to learn about our data. For example, starting with a base theory, we can increase the flexibility of our theories in stages, and learn something at each step along the way. In this case, our base theory values a gamble, which determines its probability of being chosen via its expected value, or its objective long-run average. Following the well-known expected utility theory, we can ask whether people view the payoffs of a gamble subjectively. To do this, we differentiate through the model and further through a network which learns to transform payoffs in a way that best supports the model. In other words, the neural network is our utility function for the overall model. We can view the performance, or in this case the error of the model, on held-out data, here shown on the y-axis, as a function of how much data we use to train the network, here shown on the x-axis. And for reference, we can compare classic versions of the model, where the utility function was chosen by researchers, in particular every form we could find, to our learn utility function. While classic models don't benefit much from more data, that is, in fitting their parameters to it, our model learns to outperform all others using about 1/5 of our data. Importantly, the utility function learn, which we can visualize, looks somewhat like the historically proposed versions, but it's more saturated at the ends, and it shows a kink near 0. With enough data, and with modern computational resources, we can rederive and augment part of this historical theory, and all in a matter of minutes. Adding more flexibility and following Kahneman and Tversky's famous prospect theory, we can ask whether people view the likelihoods of outcomes subjectively as well, learning neural networks U and pi for outcomes and probabilities, respectively. Again, combinations of classic forms for these functions, which define a large set of theories, don't benefit much from data. And again, with about 40% of our data, we can learn functions that outperform these previously proposed ones. So looking at the learned functions, utility is roughly the same, and additionally, medium to low probabilities are now overweighted, which contrasts somewhat with classic forms. Looking at our two learned models together, we can see that models in the prospect theory class broadly fit human behavior better than expected utility, as we might expect from the literature. We also looked at the most popular modern variant of prospect theory called cumulative prospect theory, where probabilities are weighted differently depending on whether the corresponding payoffs are gains or losses. Interestingly, this model performed worse than the classic one, but learned with less data. And this result is a bit surprising, because CPT has been thought of as the successor to the original form. At least for our data, this wasn't the case. The reason could have something to do with the fact that, despite having two weighting functions, CPT imposes additional constraints on the way these functions are applied in its value computation, which may be limiting in some ways. But for now, the answer isn't yet clear. Moving into less familiar territory, we explored a broader class of functions that allow outcomes and probabilities within a gamble to interact nonlinearly. In particular, a neural network maps from all parameters of a single gamble with outcomes and probabilities together to the probability of choosing that gamble. We call this model class value-based, since it computes a gamble's value in an unconstrained way. As you can see, taking advantage of this added flexibility, this model outperforms all others, but it required almost half of our data to do so. In fact, the drop in error is larger than any we've seen so far. And this is our first hint that prospect theory and related models are not complex enough to fully predict human behavior. Finally, we trained a neural network to output decisions given both gambles as input to the same function. Because the value of a gamble in this case is allowed to depend on another gamble, this function class asks the question of whether the psychological value of a gamble is sensitive to context. This model is also an upper performance bound for the best possible theory because it has no constraints. To make things a bit simpler, note that in this case, we don't really have a model that's separate from a neural network component anymore. We just have a single neural network which maps from all information about the gamble to a decision probability. So all along, the more structured models above could be seen as a set of constraints on what can be learned, which we've now fully removed. If removing constraints improves performance, it means our assumptions were too rigid. And yet again, this model outperforms all others, this time by a much wider margin than before, but also continues to make use of more data even after this fact. This indicates that there's more systematic variance left to explain, and more complexity required by current theories, which we've learned to address here using data. Notably, all of this just isn't possible with smaller datasets. The next largest datasets to ours are marked here on the x-axis, and were we to use these datasets, CPT would appear to be the best performing model, and we would have rejected the need for greater complexity that's exemplified in our other model classes. To summarize, when we have enough data, we can answer new questions. For example, we can ask whether classic psychophysical functions are optimal or whether they can be improved. We can also ask if human behavior violates assumptions of classic theories more directly. In particular, we found this to be true in at least two important ways, concerning the nonlinear interaction between outcomes and their likelihoods, as well as between gambles. More generally, the breadth of our dataset reveals systematic human behavior that's not captured by current theories, and will need to become more complex to fully explain people. Okay, let's move on from decision making and focus on human category learning. Again, as a preview, whereas in the previous section we scaled the number of data points only, here we're going to increase the complexity too. specifically in the types of stimuli we're going to consider. In the course of this, we'll come up with conclusions that are at odds with those in laboratory settings, and we'll learn a few other interesting things along the way. So in this domain, we're interested in how people learn to represent categories, given examples of them. So given a new, unlabeled object in a world, we use the representation we've learned of that category to generalize to a new object. But what representations should we use? In prototype theory, we assume that the learner abstracts a central member of the category, which can later be compared to new instances for the purpose of categorization. In another popular competing theory, we assume that the learner memorizes all exemplars and compare new stimuli to those in memory later. In the literature, these models often make better predictions of human behavior than prototype models, although both theories are influential. However, many of the seminal tests of these theories are with respect to small sets of relatively simple stimuli and aren't well tested in high dimensions. In one of our recent papers, we simulated the relative performance of both models on artificial categories, varying the complexity of the category distributions to be learned, the dimensionality of the feature space, and the available data. And what we found was that exemplar models systematically perform better than prototypes when the categories are complex, when they're low dimensional, and when there's lots of available data. However, intuitively, when the first and third of these is true, the second may not be true. That is, many natural stimuli are complex, and they contain many featural dimensions. So, to create conditions for testing these questions with real human behavior, we collected CFAR 10H, which comprises over 500,000 categorization judgments, 50 per image, for 10,000 images from 10 object categories. You can download this dataset for yourself at the link shown here. So here are some examples from the dataset. The first two images are confidently classified as a plane and a cat, but the bottom two elicit substantial disagreement. So our dataset spans a range of both easy and difficult images. But we're still left with a problem, and that's that natural images are just not easy to represent, and we don't want to use pixels directly. To solve this, we can use convolutional neural networks, which have seen wide success for image representation in machine learning. We can use these representations, over 10,000 images, as inputs to our categorization models. And while they're much lower dimensional than images, they're much higher dimensional than typical representations used in cognitive science. In the case of prototype models, the probability of assigning a category label to an image is proportional to its distance to the mean of that category in the feature space. In the probabilistic formulation, we can also choose to include information about the covariance of the class as well, if we want. For exemplar models, the probability is instead proportional to the sum distance to all members of the category. Looking at the results, we can see that supervised CNN representations, the two sets of bars on the right, fit the human data best, with lower negative log likelihood, which assess absolute fit, and lower AIC, which takes model complexity into account. More importantly, the often observed advantage of exemplar models is no longer seen in this context. In fact, some prototype models make better predictions of people, either when the image is ambiguous, or when looking at predictions of the second most common label assigned by people, and not just the most obvious one. You can also see here that using the raw classification outputs of the CNN models actually gave the worst performance. Now this is an interesting result because the CNN itself is a categorization model, just not one from cognitive science or one that's meant to model humans explicitly. One of the most striking things about CNNs in general is that they're the only models that rival human abilities for natural images. But they differ in some ways. For example, the previous results. They also don't seem nearly as robust as humans. For example, previous work has shown that the performance of CNNs can be effectively destroyed just by adding imperceptible bits of noise to the input images in a method called adversarial attacks. Further, sometimes just using images from a different dataset is enough to reduce performance. So this motivates a new question. Should machine learning models behave more like people, assuming they had the option to do so? To test this, we trained several CNN classifiers directly on human guess proportions instead of the typical one-hot vectors, which pick out only the true class for each image. This trains the model to express uncertainty patterns like people, and provides hints about which classes and images are more similar than others. In every case we examine, the human-trained networks show better generalization to unseen classification benchmark datasets than typical networks. And the more out of distributions these datasets were, for example, swapping cats for lions, the larger the advantage was. Human-trained networks also exhibited greater robustness to the sorts of adversarial attacks we mentioned earlier, where noise added to the image destroys performance of the trained model. Even in cases where our networks were still confused by the attacks, they were less confident in the mistakes they made than typical networks. So these are encouraging results, but why do CNNs differ from people in the first place? How can we close the gap without using human data as an explicit teacher? Recall that previously, we used CNN representations to test prototype and exemplar theories, but our representations in a sense were borrowed. That is, they were taken from pre-trained networks which don't employ prototypes or exemplars, but instead learn linear class boundaries. To remedy this, we trained a set of CNNs to learn representations from the ground up that can support cognitive models. In particular, the final linear classification layer of standard CNNs was replaced by either a prototype or an exemplar model. During training, error is backpropagated through the categorization model and through the CNN, learning a set of features that best supports each proposed cognitive strategy. We use standard labels instead of human behavior for training in this case, in order to assess the intrinsic ability of these models to capture human behavior out of the box, which is what we want. Further, we included a more recent, less popular categorization model, wherein a category is represented by a set of K clusters, as opposed to single prototypes or all data points. So looking at the basic results, we found that cognitively inspired CNNs obtain better classification accuracy than typical networks in almost all cases. Further, we compared the pattern of uncertainty from human response proportions in our CFAR10H dataset, which were unseen to the model during training, to the outputs of the trained network, and using cross-entropy as our error metric. And we found that all cognitively inspired CNNs, those with prototypes, those with exemplars, and everything in between, had better intrinsic fit to human behavior than typical CNNs. Next, by varying the number of clusters, where one cluster is a prototype and a cluster per data point is an exemplar model, we see that neither prototype or exemplar models won out. Instead, models that represent categories using about 10 to 20 clusters were best, both in accuracy and fit to people, providing evidence that models with medium complexity may be the best for natural images. If you want to see more detailed results from this paper, or hear more about the model formulations, you can stop by the full talk by the lead author tomorrow in the categorization track. So, in summary, we found here that theory evaluation can differ in high dimensions, and depending on the size of the dataset. In the case of natural visual categories, we found that models that behave more like people are objectively better in some ways, and that multi-cluster representations of categories seem to match people better than the more well-studied theories would suggest. So to wrap up, let's step back and draw some overall conclusions that you can think about in relation to your own research. First, scaling datasets provides more variance to explain, which simple theories won't be able to capture, and thus provides us with targets to refine our theories. Next, we don't have to build in everything about our theory by hand. Instead, we can build in the assumptions we want and learn the rest, as long as we have the data to power it. And while the learned parts aren't always fully interpretable, they can still be informative, and thus inform future theory development. And lastly, conclusions from the laboratory may not transfer to big data sets, and in fact, they may even contradict them sometimes. If you have a theory or a finding and you want to build confidence in it, large datasets provide robust evaluation. Thanks again to the many collaborators on these projects, those funding the work, and you for listening.